Hey everyone, so my name's Sarah Monahan, and I am a former child actor and an author. And today I want to have kind of a heavy conversation. When I was a kid, I was on a TV show called Hey Dad, which was basically the most successful sitcom in Australian history at its time. It may have been beaten by now, but back then we were the highest rating, longest running sitcom in Australian television history. I auditioned for Hey Dad when I was 6 years old.
Jenny, what is that?
That's breakfast. That's
You can't have baked beans for breakfast.
And I left when I was 15. I was in over 200 episodes, so I was on that show for a long time. The show was syndicated around the entire world. We were dubbed into multiple languages. Other countries bought the show for their own and made their own versions of it. But basically, it was huge. And if you wanted to put it into like American terms, it was like The Cosby Show. And not only was it like The Cosby Show in how popular it was and how much loved the dad in Hey Dad, it was also like The Cosby Show because in the end, it turned out that the dad on Hey Dad was also a sexual offender. Way back in 2010, which was well before any of the new revolution of sexual assaults recognitions that we have now, I was asked to do an article about what it was really like to be a child actor on that TV show. And this wasn't some like where are they now type thing. These people knew what had happened on the show because a few months before we had done it started with the radio station had wanted to do like a where are they now type thing, and all of the cast had said that they would do the reunion but only if the dad wasn't part of the show. And then like 6 months later, there was a TV show called Where Are They Now, who also wanted to do a TV show showing all of us. And we also all agreed, unbeknownst to the other cast members, that we would do the show, but only if the dad wasn't there. So we all turn up. I had to fly in from the US because I live in the US now. And we all show up, we do this TV show, and it's a Hey Dad reunion and the dad isn't there, which of course made people kind of question why he wasn't there. But he had moved to Singapore with his wife, who was a very successful agent. And so I guess people just kind of thought maybe he didn't. But inside the industry, tongues started wagging. And it took a journalist probably 3.6 seconds to find out the reason that none of us wanted him there was because he was a sex offender. So I kept getting asked to do this article. I kept saying no, no, no. It actually took about 2 years before I decided that yes, I would do the article. And it came out the week that Corey Haim died. I thought it was going to be just a small article in a local magazine and that it would just be like we had agreed that we weren't going to name the person. It was just a this happened to me on set. So, if you're a parent who's thinking of putting their kids in the industry, please be careful. And that was what it was meant to be. That is not what ended up happening. Living overseas, I had forgotten how popular Hey Dad was. And apparently a lot of people were very upset that I would come out and name somebody or not name somebody, but say that this happened to me on the show. And everybody wanted to know who it was. People were saying I was tarnishing the entire industry. Hello, Barbara Walters. And basically people were pretty pissed off that I had ruined the memories of their favorite TV show. A TV show called A Current Affair picked it up and they wanted to go with it. And I was still in the US and I'm trying to deal with a 15-hour time difference of like dealing with normal things that were my life in America and all of this stuff that was happening in Australia. And eventually I had to fly out. I was on A Current Affair, but they'd already had a bunch of other girls come forth and say that they knew who it was because he had also done it to them. I'm just going to skip a whole bunch of stuff here because it's long and tedious. And if you're really interested, it's in the book. But basically what happened is it ended up 5 girls went to court. It wasn't a quick process. SVU makes it look like somebody comes forward and a week later they're arrested and a week after that you're in court. Nicely done. What really happens is when you accuse someone publicly, especially someone who is that prominent, basically your entire world is turned upside down. Everybody hates you. You will never work again at this point. And everybody thinks that you are doing it for an extra 15 minutes of fame or for some money. But here's a hot tip. there's no money, and there is definitely no, I mean, there's like a little bit of fame, but it's not the kind you want. You're not getting asked to work. You're not getting jobs. People are writing thousands of pages about you on the internet, and it's not flattering. Now, on the other side, when I spoke up so publicly, apparently this company called Bravehearts, who deals with childhood sexual assault in Australia, they ended up asking me to be an ambassador for them because literally thousands of people called into their hotline and said that they had also been sexually assaulted as children and that they were speaking up now because I had done so publicly, and that prompted them to do the same. So it was really hard personally, but on the other hand, I had done something where I had given a voice to literally thousands of people to also speak up and finally talk about the fact that they had been sexually assaulted. Now, it took 2 years before the guy who did it was arrested. It took so long for the investigation, and I didn't realize at the time how many girls were involved, because in the end, when we did go to court, there was 5 of us, but it turned out, I found out 7 years later, that there was 18 girls that the police knew of, and only 5 of us went to court because some of them were so broken that they actually said that they shouldn't go to court and be witnesses or try to charge him because they probably would not survive the court process. But while we were waiting for him to finally be arrested, I'm frantic because I'm overseas. It's my reputation on the line. I was the only person that people knew publicly had accused him, even though there was a slew of girls, and it turns out one of them had been to the police at least twice before, and they lost her paperwork each time. But I am the public face of this case. So every person who hates anybody on the internet is coming at me. So I am trying to do something like writing to every senator in Australia and be like, hey, do you think we could change some laws? Do you think we could make it a safer place for children? Darren Hinch, who was a TV personality back in the day, and he had like a 60 Minutes type TV show. He actually was running as a senator, and he came to the US and interviewed me about a child sex offender registry because he was desperately trying to get that implemented in Australia because we don't have one there. I don't understand why. It works perfectly fine in the US, but they don't have this. I'm also writing to everybody, the prime minister at the time, and everybody being like, look, we need to do something. And finally, one day, they did. And I'm not claiming that I did this or had a part in it, but I guess I manifested it enough. And then we had the Royal Institution into childhood sexual assault. It was institutional responses to childhood sexual assault. But basically what it meant was they were finally going to look into the Catholic Church and boarding schools and all the stolen children in Australia and gymnastics and tennis and all these people and see how all of these people dealt with childhood sexual assault. And to me, like, it was a huge win that we were finally acknowledging the little people in Australia and the children, and the adult in all of us could finally do something for the inner child. At first, I was asked to be a speaker at the Royal Commission, but then they decided because I was still going through the process of my own court case, they didn't want anything I said there to jeopardize my case. So they asked me a lot of questions behind the scene that weren't in public, which was amazing. I just never had to go through the actual court process publicly for the Royal Commission. Now, the bad guy in this had been living in Singapore, but while he was being investigated, he moved to London. So he was finally arrested in London during the London Olympics of 2012. And it was kind of cute because the police did it very publicly. And they also made sure to arrest him very late in the afternoon so that he would have to spend at least one night in jail. It still took another year before he was extradited and another year after that before we finally went to court. So it is 4 years at this point since I first publicly accused this man of being a childhood sexual assaulter or a pedophile to when we finally made it to court. And during this time, it didn't die down. Like, it was still, like, there are newspapers and they called it the biggest scandal in Australian television history. It was outrageous that an actress spoke up against somebody else in the industry. And I mean, I had people, not just like regular civilians who were being mean to me. I mean, there were like, I was getting death threats from agents and actors. Like, I'm trying to help the industry by making it a safer place for kids, and you guys are like wanting me to die. Now, the original casting agent for Hey Dad, Liz Molinar, she had left the industry, and she had actually started a retreat for victims of childhood abuse, whether it was sexual, emotional, physical, whatever. And she asked me to come to the retreat for a week, and I did. And it was the best thing that I ever did, because it was truly a week of just learning to deal with your emotions and coping. And I did it like right before I went to court. And court was awful. Court was so hard, and I'm honestly, I don't know if I would have made it. I almost didn't, but I don't know if I would have made it without the tools that I learned at Heal for Life. So if you're in Australia and you are a childhood victim of any kind of trauma, absolutely look into Heal for Life. They will do more for you in a year than you can do 5 years with an outside psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist. Heal for Life is definitely a game changer. So we finally get a date for court, and I was going to have to fly back from the US. And I mean, I flew by myself, and I knew I was flying into a shit show. Like, it was terrible going by myself to a court case that I knew was going to be just the biggest deal the country had ever seen. Now, Australia has a thing called suppression orders, which is where basically anytime there's a court case that they don't want being public, they just slap a suppression order on it, and nobody can report on it at all. Now, I had spent 4 years of literally seeing this coming up every day, all the time. And then all of a sudden, like the week before court, it went silent. And nobody told me there was a suppression order. I got a friend who's a journalist, and he messaged me and said, just so you know, there was a suppression order on the case. And so here I am. I've spent 4 years in the media being vilified for going to court against this man. And now we're finally going to court, and they've silenced it? Like, I've been waiting 4 years for this to go to court so I can finally tell my story, so that we can finally hear all of the things, so that the other girls can finally have a voice. And some judge is like, no, we're going to make it quiet. And this is when I knew who my actual friends and followers who really cared for me were, because even though there was a suppression order, they had been watching and they knew we were going to court, and they sent me messages privately telling me that they were with me. And I tried to think of it as, well, okay, so they've made it quiet, which means that if it doesn't go well, if we lose the case, if he is found not guilty for some reason, that at least it won't be public. It'll have just disappeared. And then just as I convinced myself that everything was going to be fine, that there was a reason for the suppression, that it was going to work in my favor, and they decided to lift the suppression order. And then it was absolutely front page news for the next 6 weeks. And I mean, like, huge front page. And it was every fucking, like, news break. It was in every magazine. It was on the radio. I mean, it was blanket coverage nonstop of the court case, with everything everybody said, with like the rendered drawings of everyone. Every night they, had the blurred pictures because we were all young girls. They couldn't show your face without permission. And so they made sure to blur everybody out, but you saw everybody. You saw the whole thing. It was nonstop. But here's the thing. I was the last of the girls to speak, and technically you're not allowed to know what's going on in court. You're not supposed to see the news. You're not supposed to know anything about the case. But when it is the biggest story in the country, I mean, front page, Twitter, Facebook, everything you can possibly imagine, it is there. So you either have to like go completely no news, or like you're gonna see stuff. So it's a 6-week trial. I'm the last one to go. Long story short, thankfully in the end, out of 5 girls, he got a hung jury on one of them, which means that if there was any more evidence, she could still come back at some point. So he wasn't found not guilty. It was just a hung jury. And for the other 4 girls, he was found guilty. So I was essentially the first, probably, big actress in Australia to send another actor to prison for sexual offenses. Now, of course, he immediately appealed, and we had to go through an appeal process. And then there was a second appeal, and we had to go through the second appeal. But thankfully, after the second appeal, that was it. There was no more appeals. And during the process, we did change a couple of laws. The most important one, I think, was the Crown v. Hughes, and it relates to tendency evidence, because we were one of the first cases where all the girls got to go to court at once. Because normally with smaller things, each girl would have to go to court on their own against an offender, and people will always be like, oh, well, it's not enough. It's not enough. It's, you know, and because all of us went to court, and not just the actual proper victims, but all the other girls who weren't classified as official victims because they weren't going to court, and then girls from like wardrobe and makeup and all the other people in his life that he had sexually harassed at some point but weren't an official victim were allowed to give evidence inside the court. And so it's called tendency evidence. And it was a huge deal, and that was one of the things he appealed on, and that was struck down. And it is now case law in Australia for tendency evidence because of our case. Now, people might think that, well, if you keep showing a pattern, that's a bad thing. And I don't think so. I think it's fine, because if somebody is just doing, like, he didn't rape anyone, he did digitally penetrate some people, he did some horrible things to people. But if they were all on their own, it may not have shown that. But because all of the women were allowed to go to court and said, he did this, he did this, he did this. And we know that the jury understood it, because when they first came back, they came back with 3 girls on the first day and found him guilty, but they weren't sure about me or the other girl, and they needed more time and wanted to go over the evidence again. And then the next day they came back and they were a hung jury on the second girl, and they found him guilty on me. But because it took 2 days to go through the 5 girls, and that one of them was not a guilty, and that they actually really wanted to go through all of my stuff again, it showed that they really did understand the process, and that just because someone does something with one girl doesn't mean that that's their only MO, and that that's the exact thing that they do with every girl. So this jury was incredibly smart and managed to see the pattern, even if it wasn't an exact pattern each time, and found him guilty. And, like, thank you to you people. But then we had, like, the appeals, and then right after the big last final appeal is when MeToo hit in the US. And, like, I don't have anything to do with that. I think it was just the timing. We'd been building up to it. The Royal Commission had also been in full swing. And society at this point was just ready. I mean, they were just ready to finally speak up. And that is an amazing thing to watch, from when I went from being the first person that spoke up and was just given, like, death threats and insults and told that I was just a dumb bitch and seeking my 15 minutes of fame, to finally we get to Me Too, and people are speaking out about, like, huge executives in the US. And these days, people still kind of feel like we haven't come far enough, we haven't done enough. But if you're looking back from where I am, and you're seeing from when you were the first person to speak up to now, it's fucking amazing how far we have come. Like, a couple years ago, Australia finally voted for a sexual assault victim to be an Australian of the Year. I mean, nobody would have ever thought when I spoke up that one day we would be voting for somebody standing up for rights for Australian of the Year. I mean, that's fucking amazing. We have come a long way. And if you are sexually assaulted, especially if it's happening now, you should definitely, like, tell someone. But a lot of us are just not going to tell anyone at the time. Or, like in my case, I did tell people, and I was shut down because, you know, biggest TV show in the country. Nobody wants to shut the show down. You can just live with it. But if you are not on a TV show and you are being sexually assaulted, you can absolutely speak up. And the number one thing to remember is it's not on you. You didn't do the bad thing. No matter what anybody says, it is not your fault. You didn't ask for it. It is not your shame. It is not on you. If you were robbed or mugged, nobody would blame you. Yet somehow for sexual assault, people put the blame on the victim, and it has nothing to do with the victim. It is absolutely the person who assaulted you's fault. And if you are an adult and you are remembering your childhood trauma, write it down. Write down everything. Not only does it help to release it from you and make it better, there's something cathartic about writing it down, which is part of the reason I wrote a book. But writing it down not only helps release it from you and help you to process the trauma, but if one day you do decide that you want to press charges, that you want to let people know, you now have it written down. You have as much detail as you possibly can remember written down that you can then hand to the police. If you are sexually assaulted and you just can't go to the police for some reason because it's traumatic, then tell a friend, tell somebody, write it down, take as many notes as possible, take photos, take every piece of evidence that you've ever watched them do on a crime show and do that for yourself, because if you ever do decide to press charges, you have a written record, you have photographic record, voice tape yourself, or video tape yourself of everything so that you have a first-hand account of what happened to you so that you can use it later if you need to. Tell a friend, because if the police ever say, did you tell anyone? When you get to court, they're absolutely going to be like, did you tell anyone? You can say, yes, as a matter of fact, I did. This is the person I told. And that person can then come and say, yes, they told me what happened, and here's what they told me that happened. And I get it's so hard to go to the cops. I had flown into Australia when I gave my police deposition, and we wanted to get it done. And it was, like 20-year-old trauma at this point. But we spent 3 days of like 12 to 14 hours a day just taking down my statement. I get that it's hard. And if this is a fresh sexual assault or rape, you're going to have to go through the rape kit. You're going to have to do all of that, which is highly invasive and horrible. But it's the only thing you can do to ensure that something does happen to that person in the end. But if you don't think you can go through that, or if it is an old thing, absolutely write everything down. Take notes. Take all the feelings you had. Try to remember any dates. Collate everything just in case you're going to need it. And then ask all your friends. If you think you ever told anybody about anything that happened to you, ask them, do you remember me telling you this? And have them write it down. And then in 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 years, if you ever decide to speak up, you have something tangible that you can take to the police. And that is, it's so important, and it is absolutely going to come up in court if you have any of that kind of stuff. One of the other girls had a diary that she had kept that had everything in there, and that was absolutely vital to her getting charges pressed against him. And I absolutely hope that you never, ever, ever go through any kind of sexual assault or trauma. And if you have, I'm so sorry that you did. And I really hope that you can find healing and peace. But if you have any questions about what it was like to go through the court process, about what it was like to do it very publicly, which, God, I hope you never have to do, because it's trauma times 10 going through that publicly. So hopefully that's not you. But if you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I will make more videos where I talk about what that was like. Just remember, it will be Australia specific. Every country has its own laws and jurisdictions, and like the US, they have statutes of limitations that Australia doesn't have. Each country has its own defamation laws. So it will be Australia specific. I mean, the feelings of what it's like to go through are international, because I think we all have feelings as humans, and it doesn't matter what country you live in. Sexual assault, childhood trauma, it's all devastating. But anything court specific or police statement specific will be Australia specific. And just know that it does have a happy ending, because it's now the very beginning of 2024, and I spoke up in March of 2010. So it's been a long time, but I'm very happy now. I'm like normal-ish and well-adjusted, and it's taken a long time, but now when I go home to Australia, I'm no longer, yelled at or abused in the streets. People are actually quite kind to me now and recognize that I was one of the first to speak up. So I did turn out fine, and you will too. Yeah, it's good. And I'm at a point now where I can actually talk about it. So if you have questions, ask. But thanks for listening to my ramble today, and I hope that I can help some of you in the future. Bye, guys.